Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Two World Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Jacob, and I have with me today my other co host, who is.
I'm Barney.
And Barney and I would like to talk with you today about the idea of neighbors and neighborhoods. We all have experiences growing up around other people who live near us, and so today's a chance to voice our appreciation, make some observations, and reflect on this amazing phenomenon that is human community. And so, as we start thinking about this idea of neighbors and neighboring and being in a neighborhood, I want to ask you, Barney, what is the first thing that comes to mind for you when you think of this topic?
I guess it would be where I'm living now because, or at least here in Japan, because where I grew up was a fairly rural area, and next door, the people who were our neighbors didn't really live so close that you would really come into contact with them at all. I think it was the case that, you would pass each other driving down the road, occasionally, not even every day, and then, wave a little bit. But the chance to really talk together wasn't much. Not as what I imagine where I live now, where there's a bunch of houses together in one area, and it feels like a neighborhood. We growing up, we had neighbors and we were neighborly and friendly with one another when we met, but there wasn't a real sense of immediate interaction with the neighbors so often. So yeah, think about neighbors, think about today's topic. I'm thinking more about where I am now, and then probably and then maybe adding a little bit when I started living in Japan in an apartment. Which we'll touch on some of our other questions that we have lined up for today. But how about for yourself?
That's so interesting because I definitely have plenty of neighbors where I live now, but my first place that I thought of was my childhood neighborhood. And I think it's because I have so many distinct memories and I lived there so many years. The people in the homes almost were indistinguishably linked with the space and the land. And so much so that when I go back, even though at this point in time, a number of people have moved away, I still just, when I look at the homes, I just have these deep memories of the neighbors that had lived there. So I think for me, the childhood neighborhood is the one that's so prominent. I lived in the country, but it just so happened that our stretch of road had a lot of houses within walking distance
Oh
of each
well.
other's, and a number of kids were in our neighborhood, so we would play together, which bridged that
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
spatial divide a little bit.
Oh yeah.
So I think maybe that's why I had a little bit more of a robust neighborhood experience growing up, which is fascinating. So if it's okay with you, maybe I'll just share a
Mm-hmm.
couple photos about that, just as
Oh
we're
sure.
getting
Yes.
started,
Yeah.
and
So we
since
can see. Yeah. Get a sense
give
of it.
you a flavor for the neighborhood in which I grew up here. So, so the first picture that I'm going to share is actually of a very important neighbor.
Oh
I don't know if you'll recognize her
yeah.
from
Mm-hmm.
our episode on grandparents,
Yeah.
but that's my grandma.
Mm-hmm.
Next door to us was my grandma Mamie, who was her name was Rosemary, but us kids called
Mm-hmm.
her Mamie, and she was our next door neighbor, and she was the grandmother on my dad's side, and it was incredible to have her as a neighbor because what it meant was that when my parents were busy or had to go to an event, I could spend time with Mamie.
Yeah.
Or if I wanted to change and wanted to get away, I could ask Mamie, and maybe
Even
she'd
better.
let me
Yeah.
spend the night at her house. And she made the
Ah.
best breakfasts,
Oh
delicious
yeah.
bacon and eggs and oatmeal
Uh-huh.
and
Uh-huh.
toast. Um,
Oh
and
man.
she was just incredibly caring, loving, and supportive person. So it was incredible to live next door to a relative like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm so
Mm-hmm.
grateful that I
Mm-hmm.
had that experience. And her property was right beside ours. So it was kind of like having two lots, so to speak.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Wow,
All
yeah.
the acreage she had going into the woods behind her, and the same for us. And so it gave more space for us to
Oh,
do things
yeah.
together. And there were a number of family events that we shared in common and would host larger groups of the family because we had these two properties right beside each other. So, um,
Mm.
and then the next picture, is such a gem. When I saw this, I could almost hardly believe it. This, this is a picture of all of the neighbors in our neighborhood,
Oh, wow.
and somehow they managed to get them all together,
Yeah,
like
right.
in
And
one
for what
shot.
reason?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
right.
was
Yeah.
just blown away. So um, you can probably guess which person is me. The Best of Britain T-shirt
Best of
there,
Britain.
with
Yes,
my mom
sir.
behind me, and then my
Hmm.
grandmother is to the far left of the photo. But
Hmm.
in between her are just the surrounding homes, uh,
Wow.
Rachel Shell, Donna Bevan, and then all the way moving towards the right, there was Jim Diet, and there was another person named Veronica. I'm forgetting her last name at the moment, but
Mhm.
each of these people in their own way were really supportive when I was growing up,
Wow.
and a number of them had children,
Mm.
particularly Rachel Shell, who was beside my grandmother and wearing the black shirt. She had a son that I played with a lot. And then
Oh,
right immediately behind her, Donna Bevan, her boys were also just a little bit older than me, but we would
yeah.
get together. They were between me and my sister. So it was this
Oh,
interesting,
wow. Oh, yeah.
dynamic where they knew my sister and they knew me. And
Uh-huh.
there was this in between space between all of us.
Uh-huh.
So,
Uh-huh.
but so many days were spent riding bikes or playing
Oh,
basketball or
yeah.
being outside, and playing baseball. And we would go into each other's yards. And so to be a
Mm.
part of that neighborhood growing up, it was wonderful because I had playmates, and it
Mm.
was a very
Mm-hmm.
welcoming community.
Mm-hmm.
And the people were, I would say, pretty tightly knit together.
Oh,
We all got to know each other. And my grandmother was such a natural host.
oh,
She would have people
right.
in her home. And so this picture is taken it behind her home. And so
No
she was
way.
able to
Wow. Oh,
draw
wow.
us in, and draw our neighbors together, kind of as a bridge
Yeah.
person, bringing people together. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so that's very special. So, those are the pictures that I brought today. And
Mm.
I think, when you're thinking about neighborhoods, that set a tone for me. Had our neighborhood been different, had there not been children,
Uh,
maybe I would have experienced
yeah.
those relationships very differently. And my expectations for how one engages with neighbors would have been different. But since I had that experience growing up, it shaped my other interactions in new neighborhoods that I would move to. For
Oh,
example,
right.
after college and seminary, we were at one point back, we moved back into Worcester
Hmm.
around 2006, and we had neighbors next door to us who had small children. And so I already had the category of like, oh, it's quite natural for
Oh, yeah.
Micah and Aubrey to play with their kids,
Yeah. Yeah.
which
Hmm.
they did, and it was great. And then after moving from there, we were in Orville, and right next to us we had really hospitable neighbors who loved kids. They didn't have their own children, but they
Hmm.
were really intentional about talking with their kids, and it brought back memories to me of my neighbors who were supportive. So we
Mm.
had those neighbors beside us, and then behind us we had another neighbor like that who was very supportive.
Mm.
And a little bit further down the road, we did have
Hmm.
another neighbor that had small children, and sometimes, or young, children around the age of Mike and Aubrey,
Right.
and they would get together.
Hmm.
So all that to say, I think that our neighborhood experiences can set a tone and give us expectations and a certain framework. And so I had the expectation when children are in a neighborhood, it's natural for them to try to play together and to connect. And so I
Hmm.
was ready to do that. And I think my children appreciate that. But I don't assume that that's always the case. Sometimes
Right.
when people move into neighborhoods, maybe they're more cautious or reticent because they don't
Hmm.
know the other neighbors and there isn't necessarily trust build up. And so it takes time to navigate, how will my kids interact with these other kids, which is true in our story too, to a point. But then my question is like, are they in their long-term vision or expectation, hoping that that would eventually happen? And maybe
Hmm.
some people aren't. They're kind of like, we have
Hmm.
our life. This is our space. We don't necessarily want anything beyond the confines of our property in terms of interaction with the neighborhood. So it's interesting. We were really fortunate, and this is the last part of the neighborhood story for me in terms of children. And when we moved here to where we are now in Worcester, I think it was 2015 when we moved here, uh, that there were not a lot of neighborhood kids at the time.
Oh,
There were
yeah,
two families that connected with Mike and Aubrey, and there weren't any younger children that were Hannah's age because Hannah was very small. But over
yeah,
time, this neighborhood, a lot of people who had moved in here were buying the homes in the 70s and 80s and raised their
yeah.
own families. And now, just as we were coming in, they were getting to the place of downsizing. And so within the
Oh,
past, since we've been here, like, 8 years or so, a
yeah.
little bit more, we've seen more families moving into the neighborhood, which has
Huh,
changed the neighborhood culture when you have
yeah.
more children interacting with each other.
Uh-huh.
And when the children come out, it brings the parents out, to check on what's
Hmm.
going on and to, talk, and then they get to know the other
Mm.
neighbors better. So our immediate neighbors right next to us, John and Dana have two children that really get along with our family. And then across the street, we have more. And it feels like I'm grateful that my kids get to experience this neighborhood play like I did, even in this season. And it's interesting, we've been here long enough that you've seen the neighborhood kids growing up. Those
Oh,
who
yeah.
started out in late elementary school or middle school now have graduated or getting close to graduating from high school.
Wow.
Some of them have gone to
Oh,
college.
wow.
So,
Oh,
we're
yeah.
getting that sense of being in a part of a neighborhood long enough that you see the change
Mm.
happening and
Mm-hmm.
the next
Mm-hmm.
generation growing up. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so those are
Mm-hmm.
some of my thoughts. Could you share a little bit about your experience in your neighborhood in Japan, and if you have any connectors with that idea of how your past neighborhoods have shaped your expectations now, or if your kids like to play with other kids in the neighborhood, or any of those pieces?
Yeah. That when you started explaining that notion that the neighborhood you grow up in kind of impacts what you expect a neighborhood to be as you're older, that really makes a lot of sense. And I think in my case, I had a friend who lived like half a mile down the road, and we would meet each other, almost every day after school, and usually play at his house. But other than that, like I think the only kind of real notion of what I had of what a neighborhood was like was what I saw on TV, and that's removed enough that it's hard to kind of internalize that or think that there are things from that to adapt or adopt when or try to adapt or try to implement when you're older. Because I think you also kind of what I kind of sense that you were getting at is that neighborhoods tend to happen really naturally, kind of organically, uh, because each house is each family in each home has these different backgrounds too, and so things just eventually somehow either start off quickly or eventually simmer for a bit and then start to build together into a more um, solid community and also like you're saying like if you're there long enough then you see these changes and you feel a history and a real sense of being a part of one another's lives in some way and that's just really neat and enviable and here I think um, the way things go in Japan is probably a little bit different. There's no real notion of playing at one another's home, but maybe around the area of someone's home or in the park. Coincidentally, maybe running into each other in the park. Um, but in our case, we're lucky that the streets the near our houses in our housing area, it's none of them are like a through street. So there's not much traffic. Occasionally, people who live there drive by or delivery people drive through, but for the most part, it's okay to play in the road a little bit, in the street a little bit. And that happens, and kids come along and ring the doorbell, and it shows up on the monitor, and then they say, "Can Yuma come out and play?" And then we hop outside that way. Um, but I think there's some kind of a bit of intentionality to it, um, getting things going as to things just kind of happening by kids' own um, impetus, I feel. But what you mentioned about when the kids being outside and the parents get are outside too, then that happens here as well. And that's a good way to get to know the neighbors um, and then things kind of grow from there. So, but yeah, not quite too much overlap. I wonder a little few places that overlap, but nothing so robust as what maybe of the stories that you shared.
Well, thanks for sharing that. That's fascinating. And
Hmm.
it makes sense to me that in different countries, there would be a different culture around
Hmm.
neighboring. And
Hmm.
as we've talked about before, um, when we mentioned visiting and showing hospitality and how the home is viewed in Japanese culture in a lot of
Hmm.
ways versus the culture in the US, it makes sense what you're saying. So that's fascinating. Um,
Hmm.
I'm kind of wondering about experiences that may have happened over the years where they were awkward or unusual. Many of us have these types of stories where
Hmm.
something happened with it that was unexpected between neighbors or in the
Hmm.
neighborhood that
Hmm.
kind of threw you through a loop or was like puzzling. Like, how do I respond to this one? So I have a couple stories that I want to
Okay.
share with you, and then I would love to
Yeah.
hear
I
stories you
yeah.
have.
Yep.
So the only reason I'm going first is just because I was thinking of it ahead, so to give you
Okay.
time to think.
Right on. Yeah.
But the first one is something that happened when I was very young. It might have even happened before I was born, but it was like a legendary story that my grandmother would tell. So the neighbor across the street, Ed. Well, I'm wondering if I should use his full name. This happened years ago. It's probably, I
It's
think it's
okay.
probably
Yep.
fine.
Yep.
Uh,
Yep.
Very nice person and very nice family. But he had a big burn pile. And and for some reason, I think he had kind of prepped the burn pile with
Mhm.
either kerosene. I think it's probably kerosene.
Oh no.
I'm not sure if it was I don't think it was gasoline. I think it was kerosene.
Hmm.
And he thought that he would stand far away and throw a fiery rag, and then it
Mm-hmm.
would catch the pile on fire, and then he would
Hmm.
be at a safe distance, so it wouldn't affect
Right.
him.
Right.
But what how it managed to play out, and I don't quite know all the science behind like how the vapors, linger, or if it's in a low spot. I don't know. Certain gases you think of as
Mm.
rising, certain you think of
Oh
as
yeah. Right. Yeah.
falling,
Or heavier.
and
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
somehow when he threw the fiery rag and it hit the pile, it went ba-boom, and there was a concussive blast that knocked him back, and it came so powerfully across the street and blew out my grandma's storm windows.
Wow.
They fell down, were shattered, and she came out of the house because it was such a loud
Yeah. Oh
explosion.
yeah.
It just totally like rocked the neighborhood, and she looked over there and she saw Ed there, and she generally was a pretty hospitable person, but she was like, and I won't quote her exact words, but
Sure.
she was like, for goodness sake, Ed, how could you have done this? And then I saw them, reminisce about it years later, and they
Oh yeah.
laughed and it was funny. But
Oh
at the
yeah.
time, it was a little bit of a very big awkward situation, which he never in a million years would have, wanted that outcome. But
No, not
but
intentionally. No. Yeah.
but
No.
that
Yeah.
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 So my second story is much less dramatic,
Hmm.
um,
Mm.
and and I'll keep this one anonymous, but
Okay.
it was around Christmas time, and I had a knock at the door, and it was just basically it was a neighbor who had accidentally backed their truck into one of our vehicles that was parked on the street, and
Oh.
they were when they were standing there. I appreciated them coming to let me
Hmm.
know, and
Hmm.
but they were probably not sure how I was going to react, and so I tried
Yeah.
to just remain calm and be a non-anxious presence. And I went and I looked at the bumper, and it wasn't that bad. Like
Uh-huh.
the tail light was cracked and the bumper was pressed in and cut a little bit. Um, but it didn't seem like it was a huge thing. And that was like one of those moments where it's awkward because normally you don't expect having to navigate something like that with a neighbor, like damage of
Yeah.
some unintentional damage to
Hmm.
property or your vehicle. But you know, I just felt like, well, the neighborly thing to do is just keep calm, and because accidents happen, and just keep reiterating
Hmm.
that it's okay. And then they were very calm, um and it all worked out. It was totally fine. Like, their insurance was very really good and came through, and we got
Oh,
everything
wow. Hmm.
settled. So sometimes with neighboring, you're caught in these situations where you don't know how to react. I think my grandma's response, you know, Ed, like, there was understanding, and Ed knew her well, and
Hmm.
so knew that, she was a bit of a firecracker sometimes too. So that all worked out too, in the fullness of
Uh-huh.
time. But so her boisterous response was it was okay. But in my story, I think that was fine too. Like, just to try to be patient, understanding, and I guess
Mm,
trust that
mm,
the other neighbor would handle it appropriately.
right.
I know that not everybody has that convenience where they would
Hmm.
trust a neighbor to file the accident with
Yeah.
their insurance, and have their insurance contact you and follow through. So I don't want to assume every neighborhood experience could be like this. So that
Yeah.
you can just, totally trust. But like in my case, it felt like the reasonable thing to do. So yeah. So, do you have any reactions to either of those stories, or have you thought of some of your
Hmm.
own stories that you might
Hmm.
like to
Hmm.
share?
Yeah. I guess so. In my case, I think some of the stories that come to mind are from when I was in an apartment, and I wanted to be like a really good neighbor, someone who, because I had had experience where this one still baffles me, and I think that probably um what happened was not meant for me, but probably someone else. Like, I was on the first floor, and I was doing I was doing Dance Dance Revolution. So I have a game, it's a game pad. It has the forward and backward and left and right. So it's a pad, like you dance on it. You do the steps that go with the game. Instead of using a controller, you are the controller. You're stepping on the pad, um and it was a weekend, and I did this often because it was really good exercise for me. And Friday nights I'd come home from work and unwind with a little DDR, and burn some calories, and then
I
on the
love
weekend,
that.
during the day I do it as well. And at this time it was like 4:30 p.m. So I doubt it's me because I'm on the first floor, and then I get a phone call, and it's the housing association, not housing association, but like the apartment building I was in is kind of like a chain, like they have their own, this people who made these apartments make other apartments. So if you have a problem, you call the call center, and then somebody calls you, on their behalf. And they said, we have complaints that there's a bunch of noise, coming from your apartment. And I was like, really? That doesn't make sense because I wasn't having the volume very loud either. And then they're like, yeah, just the person is, said it's noisy. And so I thought, well, okay. And I guess it must have been the DDR, I guess. But then I stopped. But then I thought, this really doesn't make sense because, first of all, why are they complaining about noise at 4:30 in the afternoon? When
Oh,
it's are they trying to sleep? And then also, how can they hear me when I'm on the first floor? So I think that it was meant for somebody else because really, I'm below them. It's not like I'm banging on the ceiling, right? But then then the next day, what I did is I took a blanket, and I took a bunch of big clothespins and connected the DDR pad to the blanket so that I
nice.
could still do the DDR pad was on top of the blanket, so I could still do DDR, and for sure it would be quiet. And then I told this to Ayako, and she also thought that's really strange because why would you complain about noise, at that time of day anyway. It's not like you're trying to sleep. And then, so then I went back to my old routine and I didn't get called again. So really strange. But so then, because of this experience, I'm thinking, this isn't right. This isn't the way that neighbors should be. And, people should feel, you know, coming from where, my image of what a neighbor should be. And then from my culture, people should feel at ease to talk to somebody face to face, especially living in a dorm, which is, in college, which is another thing that's actually pretty rare in Japan. So probably Japanese people don't grow up with that notion of having noisy dorm neighbors and then, not being so sensitive in an apartment. So then when new neighbors moved in next to me, I would always try to try to run into them and say, you know, I'm, if there's ever a problem, if I'm ever being noisy or anything like that, feel free to like, just like tap on the wall or come over and say something like that. And but yeah, thankfully no one ever um thought that other than that, no one really ever thought that I was being too noisy. But um then here, I don't know. Here, I think maybe I mentioned this in on previous episodes. Like I am used to like, you know, inviting people over or like trying to if you run into someone and you have something you want to ask about, then having them come into your house, no, nothing like that to talk. And we had one neighbor who Ayako kept saying, my wife kept saying, oh, I really want to talk to her. I hope that I have the chance to run into her. I really want to talk to her. And then I ran into her, and Ayako wasn't here. Actually, her sister was here at the house, and I said, "Oh, my wife has this question. Could you come over for a little bit?" Because I was like, instead of hearing my wife saying, for weeks on end, I really want to talk to her. I thought, let's grab the bull by the horns and
Oh,
like get this going. Whatever it is she really wants to talk to her about. She isn't getting it done. So let's try to step in here and be the mediator and get this done for once. And thankfully the neighbor was, I think she felt a little bit aback, but she's such a nice neighbor anyway that I taken aback that I think that she didn't mind. And I think I probably mentioned this, but she's like, oh wow, your house is designed so differently from ours. And because I'm really curious what other people's homes look like, but never in a million years will I get to see them on the inside. um and then my sister-in-law was felt awkward too. So I'm the only one who's like oblivious to everyone feeling awkward because I was like, yeah, this is just normal. This is what you do. And then they're like, oh well, you know, she Mayako just wanted to know if your dad is doing calligraphy lessons. Oh, well, yeah, he kind of does. He's anytime new student is okay. And I'm thinking, oh, I'm so glad that I got this done. And then later then it dawned on me, and then I felt properly embarrassed, I think. But yeah, that was a case of like trying to fit your idea of what a neighborhood should be into a space where that idea doesn't really exist, and then seeing what
uh,
happens. But I wonder if maybe um the other neighbor appreciated that in the end, like kind of felt like a flavor of neighborliness and thought, oh, that Martin guy, he's okay. And actually, now as I tell that story, I think of one other good story of kind of an awkward situation where we there's uh, one neighbor down the road that like he is American, and but he's a pilot, so he's not often here. And actually, since COVID, they've not been here at all. They live in the U.S. now, but occasionally he would have little neighborhood parties, and I was there and chatting with the people, and then I think we'd been here for about 2 or 3 years, and one neighbor who's actually a police officer, he said, I wanted to ask you about that park next to your house. And I thought, uh-oh. Because we were the first people in this area and there was no one on the other side of the park. So in our prefecture, whenever you have a housing area, that it's mandated that you have a park. And in this case, I'm saying a park with quotation marks around it because it's basically just a small little plot of land that couldn't be developed. And then so they put in two benches, a few trees, and some bushes, and one of the trees died. So,
Oh,
so there was
okay.
no one around. So I thought, hey, here's my chance. So I took a few pictures, uploaded them on Google Maps, and then I named it Martin Park. And then Google approved it. And so now it's on Google Maps as Martin Park. And and then so fast forwarding to this party, this neighborhood gathering, he's like, and then when he mentioned that, other people kind of gathered around, and I was like, oh no, I've really done it now. And I was like, oh, about that, I'm so sorry. It was long ago, and I've since contacted Google. This is true, and tried to get them to rename it, but they never renamed it. And then they're like, no, actually, we really like it. They said it gives this place a real international feel to it. We like that idea. So then it's stuck. So thankfully, yeah, it's
You
been
have your
Martin
own
Park.
park.
I have my own park. I have my own park. It's
So
been
I
that
could
way
plug
for
Martin Park into
yeah.
Google Maps,
Mm-hmm.
and if
And
when I'm
somewhere in
visiting
Japan.
next,
Mm-hmm.
and then
Mm-hmm.
it'll just take me
Yep.
right by your house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. And somehow the place where I was teaching university kids, one kid came up to me and he said, hey, I found this place called Martin Park. Is that you? Yes, it is. So
I love that story.
yeah, yeah. So
Very few
thankfully
of
I
us,
had a good idea. Yeah.
very
No one
few of
had
us.
their own park. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man. I mean, for years I had Jacob's Field, which was pretty big in Cleveland, but
That's pretty impressive. Yeah, right. Yeah.
uh
Yeah. So
that's funny.
hopefully this is something that like maybe if it stays, then over the years it might become some kind of thing. Might this Martin Park might turn into something, maybe one day there'll be a sign,
Oh
but
man, that would be
yeah.
amazing. That would be amazing.
Yeah.
Or if you, I mean, not that you're ever planning to, but if you ever moved, but like the
Oh,
park would endure, is this
yeah, I do. Yeah, right. Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. Oh, that park. Yeah, it's named after a guy who used to live there.
uh, well, one other thing that I wanted to talk about related to neighborhoods are activities and
Mm-hmm,
events.
mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
so a
mm-hmm,
few years
mm-hmm.
ago, we had a neighborhood block party, and it was our street and a parallel street and a connecting street. And they did a really good job getting word out about it. I think that they might have actually put flyers in all mailboxes on the streets. And
Wow.
then a, for those who are on Facebook, there's actually like a neighborhood Facebook
Wow.
page that
Mm-hmm.
they were advertising it there. So Katie and I participated and with our kids and went, and it was really well done. They cordoned off one of the streets and had
Mm,
tables and food, and it was just a really nice chance to talk and connect. And so and I wouldn't necessarily say that I think that that's super common. Like I
right.
haven't experienced that many times in my life,
Mm-hmm.
but it was a unique event. I was kind of wondering, when you think of neighborhood events, does anything like that jump out to you that's ever happened or you've ever been a part of?
Yeah, I had a friend from junior high and he lives on McClure, which I think is just
Oh
right
yeah,
next to you.
yeah.
And I remember when I was just at his house and they had organized like the kids there had organized a talent show.
Wow.
And like yeah, and like some of the neighbors came over and everyone just did a little talent and I thought this is amazing. I can never imagine anything like this happening. And it was done by the kids. And then people came over to watch too. And I thought, wow, that's just fantastic. But we don't have anything. Uh, we used to actually before COVID. We used to maybe once a year or so have at least some of the neighbors. There's about 100, more than 100 houses in this area, our neighborhood area. Like that's actually this named neighborhood. But a number of people would organize like some kind of um, supper or some kind of something at a restaurant. But um, it didn't always coincide with how I appreciate dining. It wasn't right my type of
Okay.
experience with the yeah. So I never really joined that. So but that kind of thing was very typical, very common for the way things go in Japan, for neighbors or even offices.
Oh,
Even at the workplace. It's very, very typical to do it this way. And so it's just a cultural thing, but it didn't exactly mesh with the way that I um feel comfortable with. And so I never joined that. But we do the neighbor I we do have community cleanup events, where everyone gets together, and it's about 3 times a year, and they just clean up around the neighborhood, around the our neighborhood area. We have you have to pay a little bit of money, and it's just like $30 a year, and then it goes toward things like trash bags and things like that. And then on these days they hand out trash bags, and everyone goes around and picks up the trash. Then they meet again when they're done, and it's nice. It says for an just about an hour, so you don't feel like, oh, am I doing enough, or should I work harder, or you know am I is it going to be so long, so you can plan, and then you meet back, and then they have like refreshments and whatnot, and um or and a chance to see other people, because I really don't know any of my neighbors around here. And then so much so now more of these stories are coming that um you think that you talked to one person, then you find out, and then like you run into them. You run into someone at that house that you thought like, oh, I thought, oh, today I met the person who lives in this house. And then you run into them, it's like, oh, hey, didn't we talk together the other day at the cleanup? And they're like, who? you know, you know, but that extent, that is actually designed by our city, like Narita City, like part of their like community sense of community from City Hall, like organizes these things. And so, like on those same days, like if you look at other neighborhoods, they're cleaning up at the same time. So
ah,
it's citywide that everyone's
coordinated
cleaning up their
effort.
neighborhood. Yeah. So it's very, very intentional. But yeah, nothing that like maybe nothing probably similar I like in your case, probably people thought, wouldn't it be fun to do that? And then like you plan it for a while and then make it happen. It's something that like the city is thinking, shouldn't you guys be cleaning up? And then and then we do. But speaking of which, like this year from April, our fiscal year starts in April, our school year starts in April too. Our house is like one of the Huns, one of our group six. We're the leader of the group six, and then there are six groups, and then so we have the leader of all of the neighborhood is the honcho. So that's where you get head honcho from.
Oh my
So
goodness.
yeah,
Wow. I
So
didn't know that
they
that was a Japanese term.
yeah, yeah, yep, yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, so Han is group, and then Cho is the leader of the group. So you put
Ah,
it together and you get honcho, and then so it's just redundant to say the head honcho, because of course the honcho is the leader anyway. but,
amazing.
but yeah, so thankfully I was not chosen to be the head honcho, because I don't think I'd do a very good job. But yeah, I'm in charge of uh, our little area this year, and maybe it's my chance. We have meetings throughout the year. Maybe it's my chance to kind of eh, broaden the notion of being neighborly. Try to say, in America, we've done this. What do you guys think about adapting it in a way? It might be a possibility. It might be my chance to kind
Wow.
of
That's
try to add a little bit of flavor to it. But
oh, that's wonderful. Oh, thanks for
mhm,
sharing that.
mhm.
Very interesting. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to mention before we close this episode?
Yeah, I'm sure. I think like it's interesting that we never got around to talking about troubling neighbors, but that's probably something that probably during this episode, I'm sure a lot of people have thought of those memories of your own. And I think probably we've all kind of had that situation, but it's nice, like you say, that hopefully in the end, like getting through these awkward moments or these difficult moments that in the end it can you know enough time goes by and you can look back on it fondly or not so there's not something that pulls the neighborhood apart, but that the neighborhood and the notion of neighborhood is strong enough that even if through the tricky parts, then after enough times that people can kind of the neighborhood can kind of coalesce again and everyone feels comfortable being one another's neighbors.
That's a really good point, Barney. And it is important to probably acknowledge and name that the place that we go to relax and sleep and do most of our life, we want it to be a haven and a set apart place. And it's particularly challenging if there is a difficult neighbor. You might at times not even feel like home is completely safe, or when you're home, you have this kind of uh, challenging reminder of sound or of things from the neighbor, and that could be hard. So it's important to name that, and it's legitimate to try like to work through that and to put up boundaries
Mhm.
as much as possible. I
Mhm.
know sometimes neighborhood disputes can be quite polarizing if it's about a property line or something, and like you said, hopefully in those cases, if there's some kind of third party that can get involved, like the
Mhm.
city, and just resolve the issue, and with enough time hopefully it can get better. But that those can be very tricky situations, and that's a really good point. And so I guess when we have nice neighbor experiences, we should be grateful because they're not
Mhm.
always guaranteed. And when we don't, I guess we just have to try to respond in a way that's consistent with our values, and to be advocating for what we think is fair and what we need. But that can be very hard. So I'm glad you brought that up. And
Mhm.
that's a challenging aspect of neighborhoods for sure. Yeah. Well, would you be willing to do our closing?
Sure. Yeah, we are once again so thankful for you sticking with us today and watching along or listening along. And um, kind of today's episode had a real interesting feel to it where we had so much emotional connection to neighborhoods that it was more of storytelling and reminiscing in a way, along with a little bit of analysis and dissection and, looking at the idea of neighbors and neighborhoods and whatnot. And we hope that you, as much as we are looking forward to our next episode, which promises to be a good one. And we hope that you will join us then. And until next time, for the Two World Podcast, I'm Barney with Jacob, and we'll see you again.